Welcome to the second of the new Minor Publishing podcast series. We're joined today by Gabriel Kuhn, who is a quite interesting character whose, let's say, CV is hard to summarize in a concise fashion. Should I say you're from Alpine Anarchist Productions, and you write on a range of topics from punks, pirates, sports, and various German radical dudes?
That sounds great. Alpine Anarchist Productions was I did zines under that name for probably about 10 years in the early 2000s, and then I moved it to a website just because it was easier, and I published some stuff there, and that website still exists. I no longer really upload new things there, but it's pretty well organized, and most of the zines are archived, and then some other texts and reviews, and so yeah.
Cool. It is a very nice website with a bunch of very interesting stuff on it. And I particularly like your book on Gustav Landor, who I think is a sadly underappreciated figure in the history of anarchist and radical thought.
Yeah, nice you say that, because it was a lot of work. But yeah, it was a sort of a mini series, back-to-back issues. There's one book with translations of Gustav Landauer texts, and then we did another one with translations of Erich Mühsam texts, and Landau and Mühsam kind of were together with Rudolf Rocker, who spent quite a lot of time outside of Germany. Those were sort of the figureheads of the German anarchist movement in the early 20th century. So it's nice. It was, especially Landau, wasn't that easy to translate, because even, I guess, for his time, which was 100 years ago, his writing was fairly complicated, long sentences, and so it wasn't the easiest task to translate into English. So I'm glad to hear that people are appreciating it.
Cool. So the idea of inviting you along, and I suppose we actually have a whole range of different things we could talk about, but the specific idea I had for this conversation was we're getting ready to publish a book called Kick, Spits, and Headers by Paolo Sollier, who comes out of this quite interesting and also probably underappreciated overlap of autonomous Marxist politics or far left Marxism in Italy in the 1970s and football. And given that this is the first time that we're going to be publishing a book in the series that has to do with sports, I'm guessing that a number of people will be going, what the hell is going on? Why are you publishing a book about football? So I thought it'd be interesting to have you come along, to have a chat about the relationship between radical politics and sports, particularly thinking about your book Soccer Against the State, but also I'm blanking on the title, the book you did about anti-fascism and workers' sports in the 1920s.
It's just called Anti-Fascism, Sports, Sobriety. That is the title, yes. And that's about the early 20th century workers' sports movement. Pretty much, the book is pretty much centered in Vienna, so-called Red Vienna, governed by the Austro-Marxists in the 1920s and 30s, but the contents are relevant beyond just Vienna. Yeah.
Cool.
And that period.
We'll get back to that, but where maybe I wanted to start is oftentimes I find, if I mention to someone, actually, if I mention to a lot of, let's say, lefty political friends, any interest in football or sports, oftentimes I get this kind of response to be like, why are you interested in football? Don't you know that this is an area of life controlled by giant corporations and is used as a sort of like right-wing sort of like control mechanism and is functioning as a soft power for this place or that place? So you get this sort of, I'll call it like the knee-jerk lefty rejection of sports, right?
Right.
At the risk of giving you a particular name, there's an editor at Verso who will instantly defriend you on social media if you happen to discuss anything to do with football or sports in general.
Okay, that is a pretty hardcore stance. I have not encountered that, but the general what you described as I think it was the knee-jerk reaction that a lot of people on the left have towards sports. Yeah, that is something I've certainly encountered many times.
I guess maybe as a point to start, like, what can we make of this? Where does it come from? And because what I hear, part of my thought process is that if sports is being used as a sort of mechanism of, let's say, cultural hegemony or whatever, if anything, that would make it more important as a site for political intervention rather than less important.
Right. I mean that would be my approach. I think where that knee-jerk reaction comes from, my guess is that two things come together. One is just a personal disinterest in sports, and or maybe even people, I guess, get irritated that other people or a lot of people get excited about things that just seem so irrelevant to them. I mean, what does it matter if this one team scores 3 goals and the other scores 2 goals? There's there are all these important things happening in the world, so why do you care about that? And so if you don't have that interest, or if you don't have any passion for sports, I think it's very easy, perhaps even natural, to focus on the negative aspects of sports culture, which in capitalism are the usual negative aspects that you find in culture anywhere, because it's commodified, and so is sports. And so you focus on the commercialization, and you focus on the exploitation of sports by the political right, and all of that. And then I think it's and then you tie it into, which I think always plays into it, the Marxist or vulgar Marxist notion of the opiate of the masses, and you just see it as something that's orchestrated by the ruling class to keep people distracted from political struggle. But the thing is, and I mean, I guess you've already hinted at that. I mean, sports, if you take all that away, you just look at sports. I mean, it plays such whether you like it or not, it plays such an important role in many people's lives, and becomes, as everything else, it's a politically contested arena where a lot of different forces meet and mingle and clash with one another, and the more that we as radicals or progressive activists, or whatever the preferred terms of self-identification are, the more we are involved in this, and the more we can influence what is happening in sports, the better for politics. Again, regardless of whether you actually, as an individual, enjoy sports or not. So yes, I think that would be my strongest argument for why people should care about sports, even if they personally don't like sports all that much.
Yeah, and I think you can see, at least it seemed to me over the past few years, there's been sort of increasing rise of people engaged in sort of activism or political expression through sports. I mean, this is kind of what Dave Zirin calls the Kaepernick effect, right?
Right.
Where you have what went from sort of the gesture of taking the knee as a sort of anti-police brutality protest in the U.S. is now this like globally recognized sort of gesture, which sort of I think will be recognized almost anywhere, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean that would be like a classic example, or the classic example. Contemporary example, I suppose that's why also Dave Zirin used that term, or refers to Colin Kaepernick. But I think what's certainly true, or that is an expression of, I think, athletes having taken the stronger political stance generally in the past few years than you saw throughout probably the 1990s and the early 2000s. Of course, if you go back in history a little longer, and you go back to the 1960s and early 1970s, to the era where Paolo Sollier played football, there you encounter many such examples. But there is a bit of a comeback of what's sometimes referred to as the politically conscious athlete, or so, which I suppose partly is an expression of more politicized times of crises, certain developments also in the world of sports where there's a certain empowerment and emancipation of athletes who are no longer as much under control of club owners and sports administrations, although there's a huge difference from sport to sport. But yeah, so these are very interesting and positive developments.
Yeah, I suppose if you could say maybe one less charitable way of reading more recent forms of sports activism would be that it becomes a kind of image management, and less of let's say authentic political engagement. But I mean, that's always kind of a tricky thing to sort of figure out, what's the difference between those two. Like, how can you tell between whether someone is deeply actually believes in what they're doing or saying, and how much of it is image management? And I don't know if you could actually ever really solve that much as sort of just say, okay, here's what it looks like.
I mean, totally. I mean, let's use the example of the knee again. And I think when Colin Kaepernick and some other people first did it, it was a very powerful gesture that provoked a lot of people, caused a lot of discussion. It didn't take long at all when it became kind of like an incorporated ritual in many sports events. People were doing it because in the same way that they would carry anti or no racism banners onto the pitch before a game, kind of hardly paying notice to what it actually said, but it sort of became part of the routine. And that, of course, devalues the gesture and raises the question of how genuine all this is. But I mean, does this discredit, if you go back to Colin Kaepernick's early protest? No, it's just a matter of how these things develop in the society we live in. There is a lot of appropriation and exploitation also of political resistance and political symbolism. I mean, this is something that we're dealing with on all levels. I mean, what do you do with, all the Che Guevara T-shirts and bags and all sorts of stuff that you can buy all over the world? I mean, that is irritating. Does it discredit the person or the politics? No, you gotta look at what's what, and it's not always easy to draw the line and see what is genuine and good and positive and what just becomes like an empty gesture ritual. But unfortunately, we are forced to look at those lines and just see what we think is positive and valuable, and what's just becoming, insignificant.
The way that I've tended to think about it is that, to use this sort of situationist phrase, like that almost any kind of politics or cultural symbolism can and probably will be at some point recuperated. But what's important isn't whether that happens, but what it still produces for the people who are using it. So, for instance, to go with the T-shirt example, yes, it might have been thoroughly commodified at this point, but if it is used in a process of communication and building a sort of political culture, that use is still important and has effects despite that.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Just like, again, if you use another example from popular culture, I might sound far-fetched, but I think that the connection is still clear. I remember when there was big discussions about the basically punk music, hardcore music going, becoming a business in whenever it was the 1990s. And you had bands like Rage Against the Machine with a lot of circulation on MTV and all of that. So yes, of course, it waters down the message and all, but specifically at that time, I do recall talking to very young people in remote Austrian towns, trying to tell them about Leonard Peltier, because I just had come back from the United States and thought that was an interesting campaign and wanted to, educate those folks. They knew all about it because they knew it from Rage Against the Machine videos. So a lot of people, that kind of stuff, it just passes them by and it doesn't really have much of an effect. But some people will take an interest. And if to bring this back to the examples we're talking about, some people will take an interest in why people are taking a knee and what that means. And then they educate themselves about it and go back to the roots. And it does have, I mean, it can still have positive effects. It just becomes more difficult, perhaps, to get to them if there is a lot of, again, just empty symbolic ritual involved.
I guess it'd be interesting to trace out some of those effects. I mean, give one example. I'm thinking about what's the year that Javier Zanetti gets entered to donate to the Zapatistas? Is that
it's not, but yeah, 2000 something, early 2000s at some point.
Like, I'd be curious, like, did that have any sort of effect on the fan base? They go, oh, we never heard of these people, but this is happening, and okay, let's find out more about it.
I'm sure it did. I mean, that would be a great example. I can't give you any details. I haven't, I don't know exactly what happened in the Inter Milano fan community at that time, but I mean, without doubt, it was highly publicized. There was an open letter. I mean, without doubt, that would be an example where you could perhaps criticize, whatever, so they're donating their money to the Zapatistas, and it's, maybe they do it because, hey, whatever, self-promotion of being conscious in some way. And I don't know what the exact motivations were, and maybe some people don't care, but certainly that brought the Zapatista struggle to the attention to a lot of people who otherwise would not have known about it. And that, I think it's hard to argue that that's not a good thing.
Well, because let's say that's one example of, let's say, sports politics at a quasi-spectacular level. But then you could also compare that to, let's say, the Eastern Cowboys actually going to Chiapas and having an ongoing relationship with communities there, such that I think last summer there was a tour for people from Chiapas who ended up playing in London. And so that's more of, let's say, I'd say a practical solidarity and ongoing relationship, which is less spectacular, but maybe differently significant.
Well, I mean, of course, that the example of the Eastern Cowboys, what do you call them? Self-organized autonomous sports club in Bristol. I mean, that very much appeals to my DIY background and my politics, and I'll take that anytime over symbolic gestures or, for that matter, financial donations. But what I've been trying to say is that it's not just an either or a question. It's not like that's what you have to do and that's the only thing that counts. Yes, to me, that's perhaps the best thing you can do. But there are other things that, aren't worthless. They're still, worth a lot. They carry more negative baggage for different reasons, but there is still something in there that's valuable.
One of the things I find interesting about the Eastern Cowboys example is I remember talking to Roger about this, and him saying that that when they first were founding the team, that they were basically burned out from being a part of the Class War Federation in the 80s and 90s, right? And so they were trying to find something to do that to them wasn't necessarily wasn't politics in the usual way, but then it ended up becoming politics, not necessarily through not through like the level of discourse, but through how it was organized and what values animated how they organize what they do.
Yeah, I think that is, if you tie sport to political organizing, that would, I think, without doubt, be the strongest argument for having sports involved. It just opens up different possibilities. It reaches different people. It makes political activism possible in an environment that is not the usual political scene environment. And that I think is very powerful. If you talk to people involved in these kinds of sports clubs, there's one question that always seems to come up, which is that at some point it becomes hard to find the balance between being open and welcoming to all sorts of people and still keeping a political profile that is more than just some words on a banner, kind of what we talked about before. So and then the question sometimes becomes in a very concrete way. It's like, okay, you want to force the politics a bit stronger, which might mean that you lose some of your members, and the club as a community club will speak to a smaller group of people. While if you open it up as much as you can, then sometimes the politics might disappear a little, because there's always the danger that if you push them too much to the forefront, they will keep certain people out or exclude certain people. So this is a problem that I've encountered in pretty much all of these sports clubs. So that always seems to be discussed. Again, I mean, it's what I said before. Somewhere there, you have to find a balance and draw certain lines and boundaries, but that's up to the people who are involved in these clubs. But yes, as a general approach, also my personal experience, I was part of founding an alternative sports club in Stockholm 10 years ago. And we certainly were able to reach people and bring people into this also very clearly politically defined community that otherwise through your usual political events or meetings or discussion or reading groups, we would not have reached or met.
Perhaps one thing I should say on a personal level is so I read Soccer Against the State twice. The first time I read it, the first edition, I was reading it as someone who was interested in, let's say, radical cultural politics, but someone who didn't care about sports at all. Yeah. And so I read it on that level. But the second time I read it, what happened is I have a son named Gustav, and he started getting into football, right?
Right.
And so I was trying to find, like, okay, if he's interested in football and I'm interested in sort of, lefty cultural politics and anti-fascism, what would be a meeting of those two things? And then that's how we discovered Clapton CFC in London. It was like, oh, okay, here's how these two things come together.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's nice to hear, because that's exactly where the book comes from. I mean, the background to the book, which was published in 2011, was in fact a zine I did with Alpine Anarchist, since we already mentioned that project, which was just called the Anarchist Football Manual, and that had its background in essentially my autobiography. I mean, I played a lot of sports growing up, and then focused on football because I guess partly because I was most talented, but partly also because football opens up more possibilities than individual sports, because it's a team sport and you don't have to be the absolute among the top three of your class or whatever to actually go to, let's say, a tennis tournament or a skiing competition in Austria. You can be part of the top 16 and still make the team. So it was kind of easier that way to have more experience as an athlete. And so I played football a lot, and then at a fairly high youth level. And then I got interested in politics with 16, 17, and coming back to what you said earlier about the sort of knee-jerk reaction, negative reaction towards sports. I mean, I encountered that at that time and sort of questioned my interest in sports and whether that wasn't, contradicting my newfound passion for radical politics. And I mean, after some time, I did feel that you could reconcile those two, but essentially now, 30 years later, this is still a big question that I'm interested in my personal life. How do you reconcile those two passions? And so the book Soccer versus the State, based on that earlier pamphlet or zine, is basically my personal attempt to reconcile those two passions. So if that works for in the context of a father-son relationship as well, that's great to hear.
I think it's worked at least fairly well personally, in the sense that one thing I'm noticing is that, particularly for young males, football is an important way of how they are socialized into relating to other people. It's how they learn to cooperate, to do things together as a team, to sort of like learn the boundaries of fairness or not fairness, or what you can do. And so I think it actually ends up being a sort of quite interesting space. And I found that, going to matches with Gustav, a lot of the times I'm not necessarily focusing too hard on the explicit politics, but more on the sort of why things are happening or why they're done a certain way. So, for instance, with something like Clapton, I'll talk about like how having low ticket prices allows more people to go to matches in ways that you can't, a lot of families can't go to Premier League matches because they cost so bloody much, right?
Right.
I remember when I was trying to explain what anti-fascism is, and I was saying, well, it's kind of like in Star Wars, like the Empires.
Right.
But it's interesting what you're saying in terms of this tension, because you describing that tension, you trying to reconcile it. In some ways, as I think a lot what comes across in the Paolo Sollier book as well. Like when I first was looking into getting it translated, I kind of almost thought it was going to be like, okay, here is Paolo Sollier, who is the footballing theorist of communism.
Right.
And the book actually ends up being a lot less like that, and a lot more him going, basically a dude who was like a factory worker and a metal worker, and ends up moving from this sort of like industrial job, coming out as part of this sort of, the hot autumn of Italy in the late 60s, and then moves from this one world of politics into a professional footballing sense. And he's also trying to reconcile these two worlds. And they kind of work together, but most of the time they kind of don't.
Yeah, I mean, I mean it's interesting, because I would say the same thing. It kind of works and it doesn't. I mean, you do, and this comes through in Sollier's book. I mean, you do at times meet contradictions, because to begin with, even at the time, and now it's much worse. I mean, if you're in a professional club, you have to deal with certain people who have quite a lot of influence on the game, of how it's organized, also just on your personal, how you play it, and like sponsors and club owners who don't care that much about the game, which causes a political tension if your idea is more based on the empowerment of the masses and also the working class, which has always been a big part of football as players and spectators, but not necessarily as the ones who organize and administer and run the game. So you do encounter those contradictions, and that comes through in Sollier's book. The interesting thing is about the book, just now relating to something that you said, is that it is certainly not a theoretical book about football or politics or how those two go together or what the political meaning of football necessarily is. It's actually more reminiscent of other sports autobiographies that came out in the 1970s, like Eamon Dunphy's what was it called? Only a Game, which I think came even out the exact same year, 1976 in England, which basically chronicles. It's similar to Sollier. It's almost like a diary, essentially, of a season as a mediocre professional footballer in England. No politics at all, but a sort of but a similar writing approach what makes the Sollier account much more interesting for politically interested football fans is that it is actually written by someone who also cares about the politics and is very strongly rooted in the autonomous operist Italian movement of the time. And as you say, I mean, and then there's other personal stuff about his relationships and all of that tied into that. So it's just a very interesting account of the time and of how the personal and the politics and sports, how all that came together and overlapped in this one man's biography.
One of the things I found quite interesting is that oftentimes Sollier can be pretty critical of fan cultures and will get angry at what he sees when people almost like encounter football as a kind of escapism. And he's particularly critical of when sort of comrades are doing that. When people be like, just because you've come to the stadium as a comrade doesn't give you an excuse to be like extra stupid.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the fan culture thing is interesting because I find that in contemporary left-wing progressive football culture, if we want to call it that, there is a lot of fan culture is just held in very high esteem as the sort of counterpower to the club owners and the sponsors and the FIFA executives who run the game. And it sometimes becomes this slightly black and white sort of David versus Goliath type picture that you have. Well, I personally also think that there are problems entailed in fan culture. I mean, as positive as it can be to be support your club as part of a community that entails both the players and the managing staff and other people at the club and the fan base around it. As alien, quite frankly, it is to me to, support clubs as big corporate entities that somehow you identify with mainly through consumption. I mean, this is how a lot of the really big clubs these days operate, with Premier League clubs having their promotion, PR offices in various Asian countries and in the Middle East. And I mean, they're selling a product which a lot of people buy. And then that goes as the global fan base of Manchester City or whatever. And that I also, I mean, I don't know, there are problems with that. And so taking that back to Sollier's approach, I mean, I remember there was Ewald Lienen, I think it was, in Germany, who was also a progressive footballer in the 1970s and who didn't want to sign autographs. And I mean, you have these examples with people like, I like to play football. I'm happy if you come here and watch us play football and are part of this, but you don't have to elevate us players to a level that we don't necessarily deserve, like the whole stardom, celebrity aspect. So I like that is an aspect of what also Sollier sort of saw critical as a, star player in the first Italian league himself.
I think we talking about fan cultures. It also has these kind of, let's say, ambivalences. I mean, I'm thinking here about like, so let's say if you look at history of ultra groups, particularly, let's say starting in Italy, you have a period where they're, I think in the early 70s, mid 70s, where they're associated primarily with the political left, right? So you have someone like Tony Negri, who I'm still not sure whether this is true or not. Whether was he like one of the co-founders of the AC Milan Ultras group, or was that just a claim he made?
I don't know. There's certain, I've heard those tales and rumors. I've never really had anyone been able to solidly confirm that to me. But what's certainly true is that Negri had a big interest in football, and that, as you said, the early years of the ultra scene in Italy, there were very clear overlaps to the political milieu, and you can see that. I mean, they're obvious even in the aesthetics with the chanting and the banners. I mean, they're very clear overlaps. So it was kind of like a give and take between these two milieus.
What I find interesting and maybe it's depressing is, so you have this first period of the sort of ultras as sort of lefties, then you have the let's say the much more unfortunate period where you get the ultras as basically fascists, and that goes what until I'm relying here mainly on Tobias Jones' book on ultras in Italy. You have let's say the ultras as fascist period, and then according to him you get the late 80s where the fascists are basically pushed out by commercialization, where like,
I mean, now you've in a few sentences you touched on various interesting and also complicated issues. So yes, with the ultra movement politically, I mean, it's never as easy as being able to define certain periods as exclusively left wing and then right wing. But what you've been describing based on this book is certainly the wave certainly went that way. Although there have always been, I think, in the ultra movement politically, you've always had groups on the left, you've always had groups on the right, and you've always had a lot of groups that didn't want to be part of this political conflict and defined themselves as non-political. And I would say even today, at least I know more about the ultra scene in Germany than in Italy, but there it would be, or in Sweden for that matter. There, the non-political ultra groups would be the dominant ones. Now, so that's one thing. But one very interesting aspect that you mentioned, which is, I think, complicated or sometimes even hard to accept for anti-fascist football fans because it complicates things, is that it is indeed true that the commercialization of football has helped to get the far right out of the stadiums because the audience changed completely. You were now able to cater to both. It's become more family oriented. It's become more tourist oriented. It catered to all sorts of things that you wanted to keep. That helped you to keep out unruly working class elements wherever they stood politically. And so it's a big discussion in Germany, for example, where everyone on the left pretty much hates on Red Bull Leipzig, which at the same time has not a radical, but a fairly progressive supporter scene, especially considering that Leipzig is in the parts of Germany that are usually associated with far-right youth culture. And that is tied to the corporate interests and the interests of selling a uncontroversial brand that the Red Bull Leipzig is supposed to do for the company. That doesn't mean that a concept like a Red Bull Leipzig, where a corporation goes in and basically creates a soccer club out of nowhere with a lot of money just as a PR flagship, that is a good thing. But it has to, if you have this sort of black and white, oh, this is terrible, the commercialization and the corporate influence, and what's really beautiful is this traditional working class football, that is too simple, because the traditional working class football could be left, but it could also be, and very often was, very right politically. So it's more complicated than that. There are different factors playing into it. Ideally, of course, we don't have the corporations involved, and we don't have the far right involved either. So that is the kind of football that we're looking for.
I think in your Red Bull example, my approach to it would be similar to how I understand their approach to music. Like, I'm not a fan of Red Bull, but I will admit that they've produced some really good experimental music events. Likewise, I'm not a fan of Red Bull, but I think they sometimes play some really good football. I'm particularly RB Leipzig.
Well, I mean, the sports aspect, if you really, we could go on about this for quite a long time, actually, because before there was Red Bull Leipzig, there was Red Bull Salzburg. So it really did start in Austria. Now there's also Red Bull New York and other teams. If you really exclusively look at the football that's being played at those clubs, it's not. I don't care about the success, but it's pretty attractive football, and actually has influenced the development of the game in certain ways. Again, I don't like it, and it's might not have been worth it, but yeah, that is, yeah. If you bring in the sports aspect, then it makes things even more complicated, because then certainly not everything is bad.
I guess what this connects to is a phrase that I always feel deeply conflicted about, and one that's used a lot, is this idea of being against modern football.
Right.
And then you get into what does actually constitutes modern football. For instance, I can understand why you would say that if modern football is understood to mean exclusively commercialization, corporate power, sort of, removing things from its working class origins and putting it off where no one can see it. Like, I can understand why that would be, something you'd be against. But for me, traditional football also, I associate it with sort of like a kind of parochial localism that involves, like, only lumping up the ball to the big guy who knocks it down to the small guy. Right. So there's certain elements of traditional football which I actually don't like, and thus that kind of phrase is always, I never know what to make of it, because, I mean, for instance, take something like Clapton CFC. I think there are elements of how a team like that operates in terms of being a dispersed community with having supporters all around the world. Part of the reason why they got a bit bigger is because of being able to sell thousands of shirts commemorating the international brigades to people in Spain, right? So there are a lot of aspects of the way the team operates, which, if not modern, are definitely not traditional.
Right. No, I mean, I agree with everything you said concerning the term against modern football. I mean, you can have the well-meaning interpretation, like you said. Okay, what people actually mean is they're against the commercial exploitation of the game, the hyper commercialization, the Super League, the Premier League, against FIFA, UEFA, all of that. So, okay, that's fairly easy to get behind that. But not only is the term itself problematic in the sense that it sort of suggests that there was a time when everything was better, when it actually wasn't necessarily, as I was trying to explain before. I mean, football in the 1930s and 40s had its good parts and aspects, and that's its negative parts and aspects, and that concerns the game and the way it was organized and the administrations and the fans and all of that. So not only that, but you do see in that movement, the supporters movement that rallies around that term, you do see very conservative elements. For example, there is this big, which comes with this term, against modern football. It for a lot of people, it implies that the only clubs that are worth supporting are clubs that have 100-year history. So they were great clubs already in the 1930s and 40s. And so that means that they are community clubs and they're based in their cities and they are worth supporting even today. And all the other clubs that come up now, whether they're corporate clubs like Red Bull, or there's a term called Dorfverein, which is used a lot in the German-speaking world, which refers to clubs that were played in amateur leagues for a long time, and then either through sponsorship, but sometimes just through good organizing of dedicated people climb up the ranks and suddenly find themselves in the first league. And then they come from towns with 7,000 or 10,000 people. And then they're, it's used as a derogatory term. They're these, village clubs or whatever. I mean, what's wrong with that? I don't, why would you exclude all sorts of clubs from your ideal football world that is based in a romantic notion of the 1930s? I mean, for that matter, a club like Clapton, for example, that doesn't fit the picture. That sort of, community that has emerged around that club, how far back does that go? A decade, perhaps? Even a club like St. Pauli that people embrace as this great anti-fascist left-wing club, 50 years ago, St. Pauli was nothing like even 40 years like it was today. It was just a regular German football club. So St. Pauli is certainly a modern football phenomenon. So what I'm trying to say is that the just this simple contradiction of bad modern football and good traditional football, that is certainly oversimplified and has a lot of very problematic political connotations.
I suppose one of the problems is if you try to create much more nuanced slogans, they end up being not nearly as catchy.
I mean, that's what I said. I mean, there is the well-meaning interpretation. I think to a lot of people that means, okay, I'm against commercialization. I'm against the influence of not just corporations, but also the big broadcasting companies. So I don't, it's nothing. You've invited me to have this conversation about the term. I don't go out, castigating people for using it, or I'm sure I have against modern football banners in my books as well. Like I usually, as I said, I take the well-meaning interpretation, but there are certainly problems involved in that slogan.
No, I wasn't bringing up to be too critical about it. I was just thinking about these kinds of weird tensions that exist in things that are even part of sort of lefty football world, where there's aspects which you go, okay, I totally get that, and parts where like, well, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, there's one part of your book where you talk about like whether St. Pauli's sort of image as a radical ref club is really something that actually exists in how it runs, or whether it's just marketing or it's just surface, which I can totally see as that. Is that a fair rendering, or am I being too simplistic there?
About St. Pauli? I think actually I would say that if we go back to something we've discussed earlier, I think that's where I would put the club. So you do have, I mean, there are it's a professional club. They might even get relegated to the first Bundesliga at the end of the season. We will see. So of course they have to follow the rules that all professional clubs have to follow. So they have to be market oriented, to buy and sell players, to make money for the club. All of that there is no huge difference between St. Pauli and other clubs. At the same time, because the club has had a partly radical and largely progressive fan base for such a long time, it does have an influence on the club itself as well. Like supporters at St. Pauli certainly have a bigger influence on club decisions than at other clubs. Some of the people in the administration of the club themselves have a history in this progressive/radical supporter scene, which even if as they get older and get their jobs in the administration, their politics might change a little bit, it still has an influence on the club that is more positive than the influence that a lot of other administrators have at other clubs. So St. Pauli is not, again, you can't say that it's just a shtick to sell a club as sort of progressive, but there's no meaning to it at all. So that is wrong, but it's also wrong, which I read all the time, to call it an anti-fascist football club. I mean, historically, it certainly isn't. And even today, I mean, it's a football club with a strong anti-fascist fan base that colors off on what's happening in the club. Obviously, that's much longer than just calling it an anti-fascist football club, but it is more accurate.
Yeah, so on one hand, you have figures of like, I'm going to blank on his name, goalkeeper from the 1980s who had a much more organic relationship with radical movements. Was it Volker?
At St. Pauli, Volker Ippig.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have someone like that where they have like that kind of more, let's say, organic relationship that exists, but probably only in certain moments. Or I'm thinking of more recently, I think, didn't St. Pauli either fire or let go a particular player because I'm forgetting his name, a guy who was making comments basically supporting the Turkish government's attacks on Syria.
Honestly, I wouldn't know. That is possible. I don't know. Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me that based on what we just said. I think that would be a possibility at St. Pauli, and it's much more likely that it would happen at St. Pauli that at most other clubs, perhaps any other club.
I'll have to find his name later. Maybe to go off in a slightly different direction for a second. If on one hand you have, let's say, the idea of football as cultural formation or exists the level of symbolism of an organization, I'm curious what you think about, let's say, efforts that have been made to almost like implement socialist aspects of football organization into on-pitch behavior. So thinking about someone like Gustav, I'm going to say his name wrong, Gustav Sesebes.
Hungarian. Gustav Sesebes, the Hungarian coach.
Yeah, because where he was arguing, he tried to implement a version of socialist football, which became much more about collective organization and about rotation and how that influences things like total football.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I thought about that. I still don't know what to make of it. If that is something that sort of people piece together afterwards because it sounds good, or whether that was actually somehow, not necessarily, I don't think it was based on sort of socialist ideals, but it might have influenced Sesebes thinking about football in terms of, building a strong collective rather than having it based on individual star players, and also seeing that each position in the field connects well with the others. And I mean, again, whatever the exact reasons were, or how that played out, the image certainly suits the idea of socialist, some kind of socialist football. Yes.
Well, the thing that's interesting about it, I mean, and I guess it gets back to these tensions again, is if you go from this idea of socialist football into like total football with Ajax and Johan Cruyff, right. People associate that with Cruyff, but Cruyff is also one of the sort of major figures of, let's say, the development of a star system and marketing around your particular star players. So it's both a sort of like a collectivist orientation on the pitch, but one which is attached to a marketing orientation that is actually far different from that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's an example for never being able to escape those contradictions. It's very true. I mean, Cruyff, not only that, but even as a player, Cruyff was partly famous for being part of the total football tactics and collective, but also as sort of an individual genius on the pitch who would do things that others wouldn't expect. Now, you could say, especially from an anarchist perspective, that is the ideal combination. You have the community and the collective that is strong together, but still leaving enough space for individual freedom to shine. But as I said, it gets similar to the socialist football. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can sort of construct out of certain developments that have happened, which once again doesn't take away the symbolic strength of these images.
Well, one thing I'm going to suggest, and maybe I'll see if you think it's a good idea, but I think it's time to revisit and reevaluate Deleuze based upon knowing that Deleuze was a football fan. And this is how I know this. There's this part in the biography of Deleuze and Guattari, Intersecting Lives, by Francois Ducasse, where it talks about Guattari has a particular party in the mid 80s, and he gets upset and calls his friend to come along, and it consoles him. So I'm trying to figure out, what was happening. Why were they upset? And I got in contact with friends who got in contact with other friends who got in contact with this guy Francois Pan, who was a close friend of Guattari, and he said, "Okay, here's the story. It was the Champions League final. Was it 85? It's the one of it's Juventus versus Liverpool."
Oh, the tragedy at Brussels.
Yeah, so it turns out this is why they're very upset, because it's
right.
Which actually makes a lot of sense. But then Francois tells me that and this is what surprised me, that Guattari hated football because it was too noisy and very disorderly, but Deleuze was a really big fan.
Okay. See, I didn't know that. I only knew that Tony Negri liked football. I didn't know that about Deleuze. Okay.
So I am now convinced that Deleuze is a fan of Liverpool. I have no basis for this, but I'm going to just go with it until someone tells me I'm wrong, and here's why.
You're wrong. Okay, so here you have a new research project. I'll try to find out which clubs Gilles Deleuze supported. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, this is another tangent, but other thing Francois told me, and I wish I could find out more about this, is that blanking on the name. How am I forgetting? Frantz Fanon, when he was at St. Albans at the psychiatric hospital, that he built football pitches with his football pitch with his patients, and used sort of like football as a form of collective therapy, which I think would be quite interesting. I haven't found out more about this, but
I mean, there are lots of interesting stories like that, like unexpected places where football plays a big role. For example, that there was a football league on Robben Island that the ANC prisoners and other political prisoners organized during the apartheid regime in South Africa. It's all there are documents, they had different teams and they were playing leagues and all of that. There's a book out about it by, I think, a US historian, I forget the name, very interesting. So yeah, I mean, football pops up in a lot of unexpected places, also in a political context, and always in a sense. I think I'm not familiar with the Fanon example that you mentioned, but it has this. You cannot take away that from sports in general, and then football as a very popular and easy to play sport specifically. It has a pretty unique power to bring people together and give them something to do collectively, even under the most difficult of circumstances.
And you can see how doing things collectively, wherever you are, is kind of always already a political act, even if it's not thought of as such, right?
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, if you again, I mean, I was really impressed by the example of those football leagues on Robben Island. Also because once again, it really appeals to DIY a DIY background and DIY sympathies, because it's not like they had a lot of help from anyone. There was no sponsorship or anything. It's really, they had to get those leagues organized all by themselves with the very limited means they had and the limited time they had. And so, yeah, I think that's very impressive.
One place I would like to visit as an example of things popping up in strange places is there's a fishing village in Thailand called Koh Phanyi. Mm-hmm. The people there watched the World Cup in '86 and got really excited by it. And they wanted to build a football pitch, but they lived at a fishing village. So they built a floating football pitch. And it's still there today, where you have kids playing football on this like floating thing, and it's kind of cool.
There is an online project. field, I forget, that collects images of just kind of special, extraordinary football pitches from around the world. It's an amazing collection. And once again, it's just the same thing. It's like, wow, people, even there, you wouldn't imagine. I think it needs a lot of creativity in certain places to even figure out where you could have a football match and how you could place two goals and how to make the goalposts, and it's quite amazing. So it brings out a lot of creativity.
Cool. Well, we're getting around about to the hour mark, so we should probably be finishing up soon. But maybe as a way to sort of like not conclude, but like conclude in a way that people could continue elsewhere, is maybe do you have any like particularly favorite examples of football popping up in weird places, or favorite, let's say, fan-owned or political football clubs that you would like to mention that people would sort of like check out?
Well, one example I'd have, you already mentioned, the Eastern Cowboys and Cowgirls of Bristol, I think are quite exceptional when it comes to self-organized, autonomous sports clubs, because they do other sports, not just football as well, with a political profile that have really established themselves well. Now, in the case of the Eastern Cowboys and Cowgirls, almost 30 years. So that's a very inspirational example. In Germany, one of the German clubs I've been following since it was founded, in that case, in I think 1991, is Roter Stern Leipzig. So Red Star Leipzig. We're back in Leipzig, but in a very different context, because it was an outspoken anti-fascist sports club. Same with the Eastern Cowboys and Cowgirls. Football, sort of the central sport being played in the clubs, but they have other teams in other sports as well. Explicitly anti-fascist, coming out of the German anti-fascist movement, and also were able to establish themselves well. And then, I mean, there's in Vienna, for example, there's what they call the Wilde Liga, Wild League, that is organized, where people can play football and play in a team of their choosing, and have a league that allows them then to play regularly and all that, but in an environment that is very different from professional sports environment, and it is also DIY, if you want to use that term, self-organized. Popping up in interesting places. Part of the inspiration for the zine I did, the Anarchist Football Manual, was that I was surprised in the early 2000s, when I spent a lot of time in the States, that very often an anarchist book fair would feature a soccer tournament outside. The way I experienced it when I was there was that soccer was sort of embraced as a kind of alternative sport in those circles. I think at that time, even there wasn't even a professional league. It was between, I think MLS was only founded later, and some of the earlier professional leagues had folded. And I thought that I felt that people saw it as something that, first of all, sort of counteracted the big professional leagues, like American football and baseball, but also was an immigrant sport. Like, it was popular among migrant communities. Was also more. It wasn't as gender centered as the professional league. So women participated, especially in the U.S. Women's football. This is actually another aspect of football and tradition where that becomes difficult, because women in European football were excluded from the game for a very long time, and so that extreme imbalance. I mean, there is an imbalance in the US as well between men's and women's football, and women players have pointed out that often enough, and there have been quite public cases about payment and all of that. But it's still much worse in Europe. So I think all of that sort of played together, where people, sort of more radical political activists saw soccer as a more interesting game than others. So that to me was surprising, was a nice surprise. But I also felt that people obviously kind of had an interest in the game and liked to play it, but I felt didn't know so much about its political history. That was the actual motivation for writing the Anarchist Football Manual, because I was like, okay, great. Anarchist people who like football, here's a bit of history. And then and I guess it sort of, fit the image of that being indeed fairly popular among anarchists, that scene sold fairly well and was fairly well read. And that's why then PM Press offered the possibility to turn it into an actual book that they were able to distribute more widely. So, yes.
Cool. Those are all very good examples, and I think that's a sort of a good thing for people to look more if they want to find out more. But okay, well, thank you very much for your time, Gabriel, and I guess we'll leave it off there.
Thank you.
Paolo Sollier.